If the wages of sin is death, which it is, the shocking thing about the gospel is not that God would choose to save some. The truly shocking thing that you need to come to grips with is that God would choose to save anyone. None of us deserve it. Is there injustice on God's part? By no means. The next question Paul asks is, why does he still find fault then? Look at verse 19. Paul anticipates what questions you and I are going to ask when we read about God unconditionally electing people. You will say to me then, why does he still find fault? Or why are we still held accountable for our sin? That's another way you could say it, I think. For who can resist his will? And look at Paul's answer. But who are you, O man, to answer back to God? The root word that's translated answer back to God, it could be translated, who are you to put God on trial? Who are you to contradict God? It's not saying, who are you to go, man, this is tough. I have questions. That's not what Paul's saying. He's not saying, oh, that's evil to think, I've got questions about this. He's saying, it's evil of us. Who are you, oh man, to answer back to God? To say, that makes God unfair. That makes God unjust. I'm not accountable for my sin. If God is sovereign over everything, then there's no way I should be held accountable for what I've done. I am not responsible if God is sovereign. And Paul says, who are you to contradict God? God says, yes, you are responsible. Yes, you do make choices. And yes, you're held accountable for what you've done. Who are you, oh man? He doesn't even answer it how most people today answer that question. Most people will go, well, we all still deserve it and try to go through all this argument. Paul just says, you contradict God about this? Who are you? He says basically the same thing to Job when Job asks questions in an unhealthy way, when he's putting God on trial, essentially. He says in Job 38, 1-4, we read, then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Dress for action like a man. I will question you, and you make it known to me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Friends, it's easy to actually understand what Paul is saying, but it isn't easy to accept. Paul knows that. I know that. It was terribly hard for me to accept. It took years. But just because we may not initially like something we read in the scripture, it doesn't mean it's not true. And actually, there's more evidence that it is true if you don't like it, because then you might actually be reading something whose divine author is God and not man. If you read stuff that makes you go, whoa, I don't know about that. I don't know if I like that. That's actually evidence that God is the ultimate author, because you're not God. There are going to be many things you read in the scripture that you don't initially like. And that should lead you to go, maybe this isn't just a product of man's imagination. Maybe this isn't just me believing whatever I want to believe. What God says to Job is basically the same thing Paul says to us. Why does he still find fault? Who can resist his will? But who are you, O man, to answer back to God? Will what is molded say to its molder, why have you made me like this? Has the potter no right over the clay to make out of the same lump one vessel for honorable use and another for dishonorable use? You see what he's saying. I once heard Vodi Bakum say, your arms are too short to box with God. When we put God on trial like that, we don't get explanations. We've got the explanation. But when you put God on trial and say, I don't like that, or he shouldn't do that, or I'm not responsible then if God is sovereign, Paul says, who are you to contradict God? That's got to be the place where we're always sitting. Who am I? I'm a creation. God's the creator. He's the potter. I'm the clay.